I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we have a Halloween special.
Part 2.
Part 2, we had a Pusong Ling story last week. Today we're going to be doing a modern story, actually a very modern story.
We're leapfrogging a couple of centuries, yeah. And it's a strange choice. When you think to yourself, let's think of some creepy Halloween kind of stories, where do you go? Well, we're going to Lu Xun, not known for creepy Halloween stories.
This story is called White Light, right?
Bai Guang. It's kind of hard to translate. It could be white light, clear light. There's lots of ways to translate it, but we're translating
white
it
brightness,
white light.
something like that. Most people translate it as white light. Rob, why did you want this story? Because you were the one who selected this.
Yeah, this is my favorite Lu Xun short story. For so many reasons.
Really?
Yes, it is. It actually is. A good short story by Lu Xun, right? What's a classic? You got AQ, you've got Diary of a Madman, you have a whole bunch of stuff. This does not sound like the kind of thing you're used to reading from Lu Xun. But there are so many things he explores in the story that, in my opinion, he explores in some ways better here than in some of his classic stories. The fact that he's using a fairly supernatural angle on it, to me, makes it even more interesting because, as you and I have talked about a lot, Lu Xun is this sort of revolutionary writer. He's the political writer in China. But this one just doesn't really fit that mold. There are some subtle commentaries on traditional China, etc. But
I actually think that this fits the mold of the sort of like Lu Xun that's expected really well. So I'm interested to hear how you think this actually breaks the mold. But maybe before we get into that discussion, Rob, could you just summarize the short story? It's fairly short.
Yes, it is. So this follows a teacher in a little town. One day, because he's an exam candidate, he wants to go out and see if his name is among the names of those who have passed the civil service exam so he can move up. But he gets out to the board where they've posted the names. His name isn't there. Distraught and despondent, he goes back to his job at the school, tells the kids to go home. He wanders home, and at some point in his wandering, he sees, or at least we're led to believe he sees, a light, a mysterious light. And the light either says to him or he hears a phrase, which we will try to translate for people later, but the English translation you are working on just says something like, this too has failed, or it's gone now. Anyway, he goes home, and he continues to follow this light. It's leading him someplace. It's actually giving him directions, and he ends up finally at his old ancestral home, and the light parks itself under a table. And so he starts digging into the ground, digging, and finally finds the lower half of a human jawbone. And so finding nothing and not knowing what else to do, he clambers out of the hole and decides to go off into the hills. And that's where his part of the story is finished. The next thing we know, the villagers find his body in the river. And that's the end of the story. It's a real upper.
There's something very Poe-esque about it. It almost kind of telltale part. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised to hear that Lu Xun read Poe's story before writing this, or he was influenced by it. But we have no evidence of that. So a couple of things, Rob. So he starts hearing voices after he fails the imperial exam, and this is like the 16th time, I think, that he's failed. He starts hearing this voice that says, you failed again, or something like that. And at least that's how Julia Lovell, who translated this story in her Penguin edition of Lu Xun, that's how she translates it. You failed again, and then he goes, and I think you may have forgotten to mention this, Rob. There's this legend, family legend. A family ancestor supposedly buried some coins under the house.
That's right.
That they're now renting out to renters, and he shares his accommodation with them just to try and get by. And so he starts digging for this gold, and that's when he finds the lower jawbone.
Why do I love this story so much? The first thing that I love about it, and which is kind of resistant to interpretations of, Lu Xun, the great political writer, is we really don't know from the text how much of this he's actually seeing and how much of it is just a figment of his imagination, right? Because we get a lot of phrases like, it seems to have, or it appears to be.
When he's dismissing his school children, he thinks that they're the ones who say, failed again.
Right.
But it's pretty clear that it's not
Right.
them. They're not making fun of him. It's entirely inside his head or coming from this white light or whatever. And also, I agree with you. The narration is really, really interesting because you have some, like right when he gets the exam results and he's looking over things, it almost seems like there are two stories that are being told. There's the story where he actually imagines that he succeeds and he's like sending these people out of his ancestral home. He's not renting out to anyone because he's going to be making money, so he doesn't need to rent his home out to folks. He imagines people marrying their daughters to him making money either at a job in the provinces or just staying at a job in Beijing. And then all of a sudden, and it's really jarring the way this story is, the story will just suddenly shift without really much indication to what actually happened. So we go from this, like, what his hopes and dreams were to this point where he's actually, like, accepting the reality that he failed this exam. And so it's just very jarring for me.
And there's the other moment that I love about when he realizes he's not among the exam candidates is in the narrative. He sees the characters on the board disassemble themselves before his eyes. That's the way it's described, at least in the Chinese. I don't know how Lovell translates it. But what's really strange about that is, again, are his eyes swimming with tears? Do they just stop making sense? Does he no longer even understand what he's reading anymore? Is he just completely excluded from all Chinese speakers just mentally all of a sudden because he's failed? You're holding up the book.
This is how Lovell translates that. Dazzled by its brightness, that is the light from the early winter sun, dazzled by its brightness, his exhausted, puffy eyes glinted strangely within his ashen face. The list now swam before him, a shoal of black circles. In trying to see his name on the list, he's losing the ability to read and almost to see, and that kind of very psychological experience is coming right before he starts hearing these voices and seeing this white light.
I would throw in here that Lovell's translation is obviously solid. One of the things I would disagree with her on, though, is it seems to be too clear in the English that it's the sun, or he's too tired, and he just is not seeing things very clearly. But in the Chinese, it's a very mysterious effect. It's almost like he is literally seeing the characters sort of decompose into their constituent parts. Because it's not that they become blurry or that he doesn't understand them. Something's happening that they're just coming apart. And a similar phenomenon happens when he gets back to his classroom. He sees the backs of his students' heads, and they also tend to sort of blur into like a sea of black, or the kids look at him and he's not even sure what he's seeing anymore. It's as though all of a sudden, because he can't be the exam candidate or the person who's supposed to move up, he's not even included among other human beings in his society somehow.
Yeah, I think Lovell's translation is meant for a general audience, like an audience that doesn't know China. That's the impression that I get. And so there is this kind of, she's nailing down things so that they're much more certain than Lu Xun is in the original, right?
Right. And, and in some ways that makes the story a classic standard Lu Xun story, but only when you're willing to read Lu Xun as a true literary figure, as in one who loves to blur all the lines, one who gives you a story and you read it and then go, hang on, what? Take the jawbone, for example. So he thinks he's digging into the ground.
It's so weird.
It's so weird. He's digging. And this is, I love your Poe connection, because this is a classic Poe move. Like, he's digging into the ground. Like, what's he going to find? Is he going to find the treasure? What's happening? You're really interested in what's happening. And what I love about that is if you accept the other parts that have happened in this story, that somehow he is being systematically excluded from human society, the lower half of a human jawbone is only one half of the mouth you would need to make speech. It would, if you can think of a human being with only the lower jaw, which I don't think you could actually anatomically have, could you? Anyway, whatever. You couldn't speak. You could make garbling noises, but that's it. And that's the last thing he finds before he goes off and kills himself.
I want to talk about symbolism, Rob. What do you think the name of Chen Shicheng symbolizes. So Shicheng is literally, Shi is scholar and Cheng is complete. And so Chen being one of the most common names in China, it almost seemed to me like he was supposed to be a scholar everyman. That is, he was supposed to represent all scholars at this period when you're facing these momentous changes in China.
I like that you just said that, because the phrase that either he hears or imagines or the light actually says to him in the Chinese is 这会有完了.
And Lovell translates that as failed again.
Which is obviously not far off the mark. But what I like about thinking of it slightly differently, because you just mentioned Shicheng, Cheng being complete, right? The complete scholar, right? So the complete scholar would be someone who passes the exam, right? But in this case, it's a play on his name as well. You didn't Cheng, you didn't complete, you just finished. And even the character Hui, 这会有完了. Hui could be this time, this era, your time, this time around. So depending on how you read it, this time it's finished, it's no more. Or this era, or this whatever, right? So all this stuff that you've been studying, all the things that make you a scholar, those are finished. Or all the way down to just this particular thing you've been doing is finished. There's so much fluidity there. There's so much nuance.
What you're saying is Lovell's translation kind of nails down a particular meaning, which all translations have to do, because, when you move it from one language to another, you don't have the fluidity of the original. You're kind of suggesting that if we take Chen Shicheng to be an everyman, Confucian everyman, then it's almost like the voice is suggesting not just that Chen himself failed again, but maybe that China is done for.
Yeah,
that all of these era or something like that.
Or
all
possibly
of these Confucian
all of these
scholars are done for.
Even the ones on the board. Because, and gosh, this is why I love Lu Xun, right? Because it doesn't say he heard a person tell him this thing. There's no marker to indicate, no pronoun to indicate that someone outside of himself said this. But the way it's written, it could be just about anything or anyone. And so is it someone, for example, looking at the board with him and saying, yeah, this whole thing, it's all done? Or is it saying, you're done? Is he himself saying to himself, I'm done? Because there's no pronoun in the 这会有完了. It's just, this is finished. This time is complete.
Could I just suggest, narratologically, Lu Xun is as modernist as like a Joyce or a Proust.
Absolutely.
He's playing with the same kind of ideas. Lu Xun doesn't get put in that basket of writers frequently, but I think that more writers should think about Lu Xun as kind of in dialogue with these other European modernists. Now, I don't think Lu Xun was reading Joyce or Proust because his focus was mostly on Russian and Japanese writers. He might have read them right through a Japanese or Russian translation.
Oh, I'm sure he read some of this stuff through Japanese translation, yeah. But now what's interesting, too, about that, he's able to do something because he's writing in Chinese that a lot of these other writers can't do, because, Lu Xun, for as modern as he was still drawing on an older classical tradition where pronouns weren't always a huge deal, right? One of the things I love most about classical Chinese poetry is you don't always have to have an I, you, he, she,
I'm glad you mentioned that. Though it is true that he's drawing off of this kind of classical linguistic openness that Chinese has, it's also being written in such a way that it's completely unlike anything in classical in terms of the psychological narration that's going on there. That's something that's totally modern.
Absolutely. And I love that he's trying to connect the dots, right? He's not... He's fairly outspoken about, look, let's stop reading that old dusty stuff and let's read new modern stuff, mostly European, right? But he's still playing with the tradition a whole lot, and especially in this early part of his career. Why throw the story into a Halloween miniseries? Because, okay, fair enough that the white light is supernatural, but what makes it creepy? To me, what makes it creepy is we have no idea what happens to him at the end of the story. He digs up the lower half of a jawbone, which is already fairly creepy. Someone digging into the ground at the instigation of a supernatural light and finding a human skull or part of it is already a little bit creepy, right? But at the end of the story, there are a whole lot of things we're just not told. It mentions that the lamp gutters out. It mentions that someone calls for the gates to be opened, and then they close. It does not specify that Chun is the one that does it. The last thing we hear from him is he says, "To the hills, then."
And then we hear a voice that cries out, "Open the gate." But we don't know whose voice that is. And we don't know, if the gate actually opens. We don't know. We really don't know anything. We don't know who says that. We don't know if that's when he leaves.
Is it the same voice that's been saying some version of "you failed" or "it's finished"? Is it that voice? Is it a voice at all? We don't know anything.
Is it Chen Shicheng's voice? Yeah.
Yeah. All we know is that he ends up dead. And that's such a classic murder mystery horror story thing. Is without knowing anything that happens, this person just dies, right? It could be anything. And this is why I mentioned very early on in the podcast, why to me this story resists some of the standard sort of Lu Xun interpretations. Lu Xun is the great revolutionary, the great political writer, because it's just too murky a story. Intentionally murky. There's no way to read this and go, nah, he just didn't really know what he was doing in the story. It's too well written a story for that. All we know is he ends up dead and he did not pass the civil service exam. Just about everything else in between. Is he really seeing a white light? Maybe, maybe not. Can he still read? Maybe, maybe not. There's all this stuff left up in the air, and instead, all we know is that he's dead.
2 questions before we go, and I think this will resolve things, for me at least. What do you think the symbolism is behind the West? Because he keeps talking about going to the Western Hills, and this is at a time of modernity and the Western encroachments on China. So that's question number 1. And what is the white light? What is it a symbol of? Is it the moon? Is it the jawbone?
See, this is funny that you mention it now, because in the Lu Xun podcast we just posted, I think 2 weeks ago now, I mentioned that I dislike a lot of discussions about symbols in this way. It could be this, it could be that, or it could be a white light, right? So the Western Hills could be just about anything. If you're determined to think of it in terms of the West and modernity, you could look at it as something that actually kills him, like he tries to run out there and ends up dead because he is both hopeful and sad. I hesitate to go too deep into symbolism with Lu Xun because I do not see that as particularly operative in most of his fiction. You can, if you want.
I have to disagree. I mean, I think this is symbolic on a lot of levels. You can disagree over what it symbolizes, but at the very least, Chen Shicheng is a symbol of the kind of failure of the Confucian scholar, right? Like that name was not chosen randomly. It was chosen to be symbolic.
Sure. The difference being, though, that is clearly signposted. It is in the story, whereas saying the white light symbolizes, for example, human fragility or hope is purely reading into the story. You can if you want. If it helps you get more out of it, you can. But something like Chen Shicheng is the language literally tells you that's what it is, versus the white light could be whatever, if you want to read it that way.
I think that's a good place to end it.
It's a murky place to end it, which is the way the story is. And by the way, let me throw this in there. We are soon going to be starting a fairly long series dedicated entirely to Lu Xun. This story, it was a real wrench doing this story just for the Halloween mini-series, because I love this story and I wanted to put it in the whole series. But you should at least by now get a taste of, Lu Xun is not the standard political revolutionary writer, especially the way he's portrayed. He is
in the PRC.
Yes, in the PRC at least. He's a much stranger figure, and his fiction is a lot stranger than it's usually portrayed. So we're gonna be talking about that a lot. So you should tune in to that.
This spooky story is just a teaser for a longer series that we're coming up on.
Indeed.
All right. I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.